Hey everyone, this is Matthew. Today we're going to be talking about a few different things about the basics of integrated pest management, and then we're going to talk about basically your own questions about IPM. And for those who didn't see the messages from before, I'm going to be taking the best questions, essentially, thoughtful questions, interesting questions, and probably some of the more common questions that people might have. And then I'm going to edit all of this and put it into a YouTube video on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol. So if you missed this, you can watch it here, or you can watch the edit later on. Either way, I hope that information is beneficial to you. The first section is going to be a bit about the basics. That's what everyone voted on. So we're going to be going over some of the theory and practice of integrated pest management, kind of a brief overview of how it came to be and what guides it. Then we're going to answer some questions in that time frame, and then we're going to shift to mostly questions and answers. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of guidance from a paper that came out in 2018 called Whatever Happened to IPM, and it's written by Robert K.D. Peterson, Leon G. Higley, and Larry P. Padijo. And they talk about how, for example, IPM they're saying that basically IPM sort of started, the concepts of IPM occurred before this, certainly, but a lot of the sort of start of IPM happened around in the 1950s, in the way that we think of it now, especially in agricultural production. And basically, the idea of IPM, integrated pest management, nowadays is sort of transformed a little bit from that period of time, almost more than 60 years ago, right? So basically, IPM is about taking as many advantages as you can for yourself and for your plants and implementing them, and then trying to leverage as many disadvantages as you can among several different axes, which we'll go over, different kinds of technique categories, basically, to your target. But the problem is that you probably have multiple targets, essentially, different pests that you have to target, and they all have different requirements for how they live, and so things that you have to do to break that apart. Usually you're in some way disrupting their life cycle. But the unfortunate thing is that some organisms that you might be likely to encounter for a particular crop, you might have techniques that will work for one, but it'll actually facilitate another. A really good example of that in cannabis is powdery mildew and botrytis. So, for example, powdery mildew is not a systemic pathogen, it's an epiphyte. It grows on the surface of plants, and that's where it resides. You could apply, for example, a microbial pesticide, so some sort of a microbial agent. I recently did a presentation about several of these, so it will negatively affect the powdery mildew, right? Well, you apply this as a spray usually, and you apply it to the foliage rather, and this negatively affects the powdery mildew because it either becomes parasitized or you use a microbe that creates antagonistic reactions, produces compounds that are toxic essentially to the powdery mildew, but not to us, and so that works out. Unfortunately, you might have had some botrytis there too, and maybe the microbes don't affect the botrytis. The botrytis does really well in wet conditions, so the powdery mildew can exist in wet or dry conditions. It's actually famous for having spores that have a lot of water in them proportionally, because spores are very small, but they have a bunch of it in there, so they can germinate in low humidity conditions. But as soon as you spray, you've now created a high humidity situation, right? You might have other situations that are happening that will cause this as well, but if you apply a lot of moisture to your canopy for whatever reason, then that can facilitate the botrytis. So you can see how pretty easily, pretty quickly, you can run into a problem where you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. Because if you go one direction with your treatment, you'll facilitate some things and eliminate other things, or manage them. As this paper likes to mention, that one of the big significant changes is the changes between the idea about controlling pests and now managing pests, and more abstractly, it's your plant stress in general. So that's a concept that has become more favorable in the terminology, I also support that too, because in a lot of ways, as we become more sort of aware of how plants fight off these various pests naturally, we can use sort of techniques to sort of facilitate those natural progressions, and then also use other techniques as well to sort of prevent them from happening in the future. The I in IPM, the integrated pest management, is how you integrate all of these different techniques together. That's the sort of magic of IPM. You can't sort of treat it like a cudgel, a hammer looking for a nail to hammer. It's a lot more sort of a delicate, or you could say sort of a multi-domain process. You have many different factors you have to consider, and if you're thinking about these factors in your cultivation, your location, because a lot of people inherit the location, they don't necessarily have control over where it's going to be. It might be their own home, it might be some business that they work at, some sort of industrial space, whatever that place is, whatever that agricultural section is, that's where you're at. But if you can choose where you are going to grow, if you're including an integrated pest management perspective from the pre-planning process, then you can be very much more successful than if you just sort of start and then find out, oh no, like this place gets budworms all the time, or something like that, and you're growing and there's no protection from them or something like that. Right off the bat, it's very important to kind of start with an IPM mindset going in. And if you have like something like a greenhouse or an indoor facility of some kind, then that offers you certain protections that obviously growing in the field doesn't necessarily have. By the same token, in some places you might not be able to grow in certain ways, perhaps for legal reasons, perhaps for financial reasons, or perhaps simply because you just don't have that access. A really common thing that people interact with is like biological controls and chemical controls. You might not be able to use them effectively with certain biocontrols, so you might have to know a little bit about, or a lot about, the life cycle of the biocontrols that you're using. Doesn't mean you have to go out and get a PhD in biology to be able to figure these things out. In a lot of cases, you can actually get some of this information from people who are, producing these biocontrols in some way, shape, or form. But you might want to have, a second opinion or a third opinion, or you might want to look at the research yourself if it's available, right? Because that gives you an informed decision, and it allows you to protect yourself from people who might just be trying to sell you bugs or something like that. So as long as you keep yourself informed about the various products, the various biocontrols, the various other things that you might be implementing, and you ask, why does it work, how does it work, and you really ask them to explain it to you, and if it doesn't seem to make sense, or there's some fundamental aspect of science or your understanding of cultivation, sometimes there are things that are counterintuitive. It makes sense this way, but it's actually a different way. I'm sure you've come across situations in your life where that's the case, right? There's tons of paradoxical and counterintuitive things in the world, so it is possible for something to kind of occur that way. But a lot of times, if you have that background, or if you know somebody who has that background, that can kind of keep you from making a choice that might not be the best. It's not necessarily that it won't work at all, but it could be that it isn't very good for your particular context. And that brings us to the other thing. Context is so important, because how you're growing, where you're growing, like I said earlier, that's of course going to have a major impact about how you're able to do what you're doing. If you only have a group of like 2 or 3 people to help you, or if it's just you, then your cultivation is going to be contextually different from somebody who has more resources, larger field to grow in, a larger cultivation context, as I like to say, or grow space, right? So all of these logistical factors are also going to be impacting you as well. So all of these things impact IPM, essentially. Very commonly, people like to use predatory mites for various things, for spider mite treatment, for for other sorts of things. You might use lacewing larvae or Orius minute pirate bugs, or things like that. And a lot of times, they're also going to be killing mites or insects that are targets. And so if you use a chemistry that affects certain insects, we might also affect your biocontrols, because they have the same physiology, right? Beneficial mites, predatory mites, and pest mites, they're both going to be mites, both going to be physiologically similar. So they're probably going to have some susceptibilities. Maybe not all or in the same way, but like it does happen, especially your soft-bodied insects. Minute pirate bugs, they are in the same order, the Hemiptera, as the aphids or the whiteflies that you're going after, that they're also going after. So if you use something that's going to affect soft-bodied insects, perhaps it will also affect your biocontrols. So tessellate your applications. Well, you might know that something like wettable sulfur is fungicidal. It might really hurt your powdery mildew, which is good, but it also might hurt your whatever fungal microbe you might be applying. Just because you know that a biocontrol is the right thing to do, you might have different sources where you can get those biocontrols, right? There are sources that might be insectaries where they directly produce the organism in question, like a mite or an insect, or there might be other places that are producing microbial organisms, of which there are many to choose from, many different strains that might have very specific effects or more broad effects, or in your particular case it might not really matter. It's a good idea to kind of know what your source is, and a lot of times I will advise people to use a source that produces it in-house, and not to use sort of a tertiary distributor of some kind, unless you trust them, or unless there's an advantage to be taken care of, which there is, potentially. In most cases, it's better, in my opinion, to go get your biocontrols from an in-house producer for obvious quality control reasons. For one thing, usually, in the case where they're not getting it from a primary producer, then it might be that the product in question, the organism, is a little bit older, perhaps it's not kept very well. You don't really know what's going on. Maybe the transportation was sort of, very long, and you're just not getting a high enough quality product. But usually, they're a lot cheaper. So, you could, you could make use of the fact that quantity is a quality all of its own, and, apply en masse.
Any last words, my big green friend? Well said. Good game.
In what we call an IPM, an inundative release. You can also use an inundative release with primary producers, of course. Inundative releases are where you use sort of what we call a bulk release sometimes as well, where you're applying a ton of biocontrol into the area, enough to overmatch the pest population. But you can also use an inoculative approach. So there's inundative, which is like an en masse assault, and an inoculative, which is sort of like a special forces, like you're putting them in deep in enemy territory, and you're you're trying to colonize the area. And that's usually a longer process, but it's also, if you use it in tandem with other procedures like a knockdown, or if you're just trying to apply very early, then that can be very helpful for you and perhaps less expensive in the long run. The number one IPM thing that you should take from this whole thing, the most basic thing, is crop scouting. Somebody's going to have a problem, in my experience. It's a very high chance that the problem is that they didn't crop scout effectively. They might have not crop scouted at all, in which I mean that they didn't really look at their plants very well, they didn't evaluate their plants for whatever reason. And sometimes there's very legitimate reasons, especially if you're growing personally, right? Maybe life is a little bit stressful, especially recently. Maybe there are other various reasons why you can't, be checking your plants as easily. Who knows? Your situation is going to be your own. In the commercial setting, however, I have a little bit less sort of appreciation for that, although it can be very stressful, of course. It's very much more important because you're usually growing with a lot more plants, and so things can just kind of get out of whack a lot quicker. And if you aren't in some way, shape, or form allowing for the ability to detect these pests, then the cost of treatment is going to be higher, time spent it takes to get back to normal is going to be higher, and threatened, for that matter. It might not actually be possible. Given your resources or your situation. It could be that there are treatments or there are treatment strategies that will work for you, but they might be sort of prohibitively expensive at that point. Or you might have to take you already are probably taking some sort of a yield loss at that point. But in a lot of cases, it's almost always better to be sort of vigilant in the first place and not kind of let things get to this sort of threshold. In some cases, that's just how it is, especially if you grow a ton of plants over kilometers of area, right? This economic threshold is the point where in which, you know, you're going to take so much yield loss that it makes more sense to treat than it makes sense to not treat, because treatment also has a cost, right? In a commercial setting, you pay for the product or products, you pay for the labor, which is very expensive, right? And if it's your own labor, you value your labor very much, so you want to be able to do it as quickly as possible, and you want to be as efficient as possible. And the main way that you can do that is by being a vigilant crop scout. Either you have somebody who does it for you that you trust, or you do it yourself. Whatever the reason, that is the very much more important thing, because if you're able to detect those pests early, it's going to be way less expensive. As many people have already mentioned in the comments, prevention is way better than cure. But in order to do that, you need to know what those pests are. You need to know what they look like. You need to know a lot of factors. You need to be aware of what you could even possibly interact with. Maybe you know what a spider mite is, but you've never encountered budworm moths before, so you're kind of caught flat-footed and you don't really know what to do. Having a plan in place and having the resources that you need to counteract one of maybe several dozen potential pests that you might encounter is the superior position to be in. You don't want to wait until you have the problem to be dealing with it, right? I think that's a pretty easy or uncontroversial statement to sort of agree with, but it can be kind of difficult to do that, especially if you're sort of newer to growing. You know, you might not know what certain organisms are or what's potentially out there, but it's definitely important for you to be able to do that yourself. You need to be able to acquire that information, and you need to be responsible for that information. That's one of the reasons why on my YouTube channel, on Zenthanol, I often make these sort of pest primer videos. I think that the footage that people can take a look at the channel is very valuable for that specific reason, because a lot of times it can be very difficult if you're not somebody who takes a lot of time to like look and stare at insects all day like me. You might not be able to tell the difference between certain kinds of larvae or whatever. Fundamentally, you might even go after things that aren't actually a problem, right? So this sort of is a great segue into the fact that when you're evaluating and you're crop scouting, you might find something that's new to you. You've never seen it before. Maybe it's some weird beetle-looking thing. People will mistake nymphal stink bugs, pentantamids, for lady beetles because they have a similar sort of shiny back. Especially as nymphs, they tend to be kind of circular, like lady beetles tend to be, that kind of a thing. There are like larval flies, like in your soil or other substrates that might, look kind of similar to each other. In my various pest primer videos and my presentations on like the Future Canvas Project 02 channel, FCP02 for those who are curious, I often include a section where we talk about lookalikes because that's very important. The number one and number two things that I'm ever asked about are springtails, which are very common, as many people know, but if you've never grown before, if you've never really looked very closely before, you might be frightened or in other ways sort of worried or concerned, especially if you have a lot of organic matter in your soil, a lot of moisture in your soil. That's not always necessarily a bad thing, but it is an environment in which springtails and certain predatory mites, soil mites, and also mold mites, they do very well in. And so the population might build up quite a bit, and you're concerned that this is going to harm your plants. And in some cases, like with the mold mites, for example, specifically, if the population is high, or the plant is very young and very tender and isn't very mature, there are cases where those mold mites either might they might damage the plant itself. It does happen. Maybe you have a seedling, and that seedling is actually succumbing to damping off. Maybe Pythium got to it, Phytophthora, any number of other sort of fungal or oomycete pathogens that are very common. that people interact with. So let's say the seedling, you haven't seen it yet, but the seedling is actually dying very quickly. This is often a very quick process. Well, the mold mites are already there, and they're feeding on the plant and the decay, really, the decaying organic matter. You come back to see that the mold mites are feeding on the seedling, and you observe this, and so you evaluate that the mold mites are killing the seedling, when in reality the mold mites are feeding on the decaying organic matter, and the real culprit was this invisible pathogen that you didn't know existed and you didn't really look at and tell. Observation bias is a huge thing to try to neutralize if you can, and the best way to do that is to know, again, what some of these organisms are and know what some of the possibilities are in the cultivation space, essentially. To kind of summarize that, essentially, here are the main things that I want people to know about IPM, especially at a basic level. First thing, there are basically 5 traditional kinds of IPM techniques. There's biological techniques, chemical, so chemistry and biological organisms, right? There are cultural techniques, which means things that you do, essentially, like your standard operating procedure. How are you taking cuttings? How are you moving cuttings? Do you use a quarantine? Do you have a regular, sort of spray regimen? Do you spray nutrients? Do you apply organic matter? What are you doing? What's your process? What are you doing, and then how are you doing? That's your sort of cultural management. There's a lot of things that cost $0 and 0 cents to implement, and can really help you from becoming, beleaguered by various pests. And in a lot of ways, that would be things like establishing some sort of quarantine, or just simply procedurally not accepting cuttings, potentially. That might be, for a lot of people that I've worked with and talked to, that is essentially what they do now, especially with hop latent viroid out and things like that. They just don't want to risk it. That's fine. 10 years, 15 years ago, there were different sort of cultural procedures that people did, and in the future there will be more, different approaches depending on your context, right? So there's biological, chemical, cultural. There's also mechanical or physical. So those are things like everything from hand killing, a very physical approach, to lasers, like it lays down a target. That's kind of a more advanced thing that some people I've talked about myself. Like light is another example. Ultraviolet radiation would be a physical control. You're physically killing the organism through oxidative stress in the extreme, and sort of DNA damage and that kind of a thing. You do enough of it, and for a lot of organisms this is enough to harm them. And then you also have environmental sort of treatments as well. So these are things that you're doing to the environment, or changing about your environment, about your grow space, humidity, temperature, psychographic things like that. At 20 degrees Celsius, it takes them a week to develop, or 2 weeks to develop. If it's 25 or 30, maybe it takes them 1 week to develop to adulthood, or whatever that is. That maturation process is often significantly smaller when the temperature goes up. But if the temperature goes up too much, this can have the opposite effect. For a lot of insects, basically, they were having trouble with molting, which is when they shed their exoskeleton and they develop into the next form or the next version of their current form. So usually for a lot of insects, they might have, like in a larval state, they might have like 4 larval states. So they start at 1, and then they go to the other one as they eat and they shed a few times, and then they go to a totally another stage, potentially, like a caterpillar turns into a pupa and turns into a moth, for example. Or you have something like an aphid, where they just have a bunch of iterative nymphal phases, and then they become an adult. If the temperature's too high, or the humidity's too high or too low, or whatever, then that can really mess with their ability to molt, because it's kind of a delicate process.
That's quite big. Impressive. Ooh, that's kind of small. Yikes.
So those are other things you can use to your advantage, essentially. So knowing the techniques that are possible, knowing how to integrate them, which basically comes with experience or training, essentially. And everyone's situation is a little bit different too, so you can't always just do the same thing and go to the next place and do the exact same thing. You'll probably have to make some changes, and that sort of a thing. That also includes things like, for that matter, cleaning your tools, cleaning your tanks if you're mixing tanks, if you're tank mixing products. Not just chemicals, but also biologicals for that matter as well. Obviously, we already mentioned sort of integrating things together so that you don't have a product or a biocontrol or something that interferes with another aspect of your treatment regimen. Another thing that's of course very important is crop scouting, knowing what's in your area, knowing what's in your general area, knowing what's in your grow space or what could be in your grow space, and then planning effectively to have a plan for each one of those. And also, if you can, having a plan or considering what might happen if you have 2 or 3 at the same time, because you might not think that that's going to happen, and you might hope that that doesn't happen. The security through obscurity is a very poor security plan. You might hope and desire that you're only going to have to deal with budworms by themselves, powdery mildew by themselves. But you might have a situation where you get spider mites, then you get rice root aphids, then you get cannabis aphids, then you get botrytis concurrently or sequentially. And that's going to be really difficult, potentially. If you don't have a plan at all, if you've never dealt with them before, then that's going to make the difficulty rise significantly based on your capabilities and resources, right? A significant aspect of IPM, especially recently, is the facilitation of the environment. So being ecologically conscientious, not using products that are going to damage the local environment, that are going to poison you or others, right? Resistance management. So the fact that if you apply certain products, including biological products, there are some people out there who have opined that you can't become resistant to a biocontrol as a pest, and that's patently false. I have many presentations and empirical research that will very comprehensively argue otherwise. If you're curious to learn more about that, ultimately, you have to understand if you're using a biocontrol like a microbe, right, like trichoderma, one of the various trichodermas out there are many. So if you're using, for example, a parasite of a powdery mildew, so a fungal parasite, for example, then you should understand that the way that the microbe is able to antagonize the powdery mildew is by producing compounds, chemicals that will negatively affect the organism. And so, wouldn't you know it, things can evolve to have chemical resistance. We already know that with chemical pesticides, but people seem to make this, they have this disconnect. They just think it's, they just apply it and it works, and they might not think very much about how or why that happens, but that is how it happens in a lot of cases. Not only is that a problem, but you might have an issue with your coverage. Maybe you're not applying with enough coverage. Maybe you're not cleaning your tanks when you're mixing your tanks, and you get a negative effect, right? Perhaps you just didn't clean your equipment very well and you transmit a pathogen that way, or you just have sort of in some way neutralized the product that you're going to use because it just wasn't applied very well. Maybe it needed a particular pH to function correctly. Read the label, understand what you're applying, and understand that you want to have you want to keep everything ship shape. So that's kind of a basic, I guess that's a little bit of a basic freeform description of certain aspects of IPM that are very important to keep in mind, to consider.